I want you to just close your eyes for a second. Well, unless you're driving, of course. But I want you to imagine a sound.
Oh, this is a powerful exercise.
Yeah, because it's a sound that you simply cannot hear anywhere on Earth today. I mean, not at the scale it once existed anyway.
Right.
I want you to imagine the thunder of tens of millions of hooves rolling across the Great Plains.
It's just hard to even fathom.
It is. Imagine the sheer vibration in the soil, traveling right up through the soles of your feet. And imagine this absolute sea of dark, muscular bodies stretching all the way to the horizon in literally every direction.
Yeah.
Their breath steaming in the freezing morning air, rising like this low weather system over the prairie.
It's incredible.
Because you're not just looking at a large herd of animals. What you are witnessing is a living, breathing infrastructure, an animal that literally carried an entire world, an entire civilization right on its back.
It is an awe-inspiring image. And, well, it completely reorients how we are used to thinking about wildlife today.
How so?
Well, usually we look at animals as inhabitants of a landscape, right? Like they live in a forest or they live on a plain. But this creature didn't just inhabit the landscape, it was the landscape.
Wow. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a profoundly detailed historical and ecological analysis that recently crossed our desks.
And it is a dense one.
Very dense. It explores the epic, the deeply tragic, and the very much ongoing story of the American bison. But what makes this exploration so uniquely fascinating is the philosophical lens the author uses to frame the history.
Right, the Bannock framework.
Exactly. They introduce this persona, a figure they call Bannock.
And the Bannock framework is incredibly useful for a story of this magnitude. I mean, think of Bannock as a philosophical ship's captain.
Okay, a ship's captain.
Yeah, someone who is standing on the bridge, looking down at the massive sweep of history, or even the functioning of the Earth itself. This captain has enough distance to see the massive interconnected systems at play.
Right, how the weather, the geography, and the animals all function like the literal gears of a ship.
Exactly. But they also possess enough empathy to actually care about the individuals caught up in those systems.
Which is a rare combination. And the author describes Bannock's approach as leading under starlight.
Starlight, yes.
Using this quiet, reliable, ancient compass to navigate long-term deliberate repair, rather than looking for, a blinding, ego-driven spotlight that only really illuminates the immediate present.
And through that starlight lens, we're going to trace a staggering trajectory today. We're looking at a population that plummeted from an estimated 30 to 60 million animals down to fewer than 1,000.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. I mean, 30 million to 1,000.
The scale of that collapse is just difficult for the human mind to fully process.
Yeah.
We are talking about the near total erasure of one of the most abundant large mammals on the planet.
And it happens so fast.
In the blink of an historical eye. And we'll examine how the wild herd in Yellowstone hit an unbelievable low of just about 24 animals.
24.
24 by the year 1902.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission today is to explore a massive core contradiction. I mean, how does humanity's relationship with a creature evolve from one of deep reciprocal survival and profound reverence into a relationship of brutal industrial extraction and deliberate destruction?
It's the central question.
Right. And what does the current, very complicated path to restoration teach us about ourselves?
Because that contradiction forces a very uncomfortable question for all of us.
Yeah.
When a creature becomes absolutely central to human survival, do we see it more clearly, like with more gratitude?
Or do we just use it?
Exactly. Do we risk reducing it merely to what it provides for us?
Right. And to even begin to answer that, I think we have to put the human element on pause for a second.
I agree.
Because before we can understand the history of hunting the bison, we have to understand what the bison actually is. Not as a resource and not as a symbol on a nickel or a state flag,
Right.
but as a biological marvel. So where does the evolutionary story of this animal actually start?
It starts deep in the ice.
The Ice Age.
Yeah. To understand the modern American bison, you have to look back at the Pleistocene epoch. These animals are the direct descendants of enormous, formidable ancestors that crossed over into North America from Eurasia.
Because of the land bridge, right.
Exactly. During the ice ages, sea levels dropped so dramatically that a massive land bridge, Beringia, was exposed between what is now Siberia and Alaska.
So they literally just walked between continents.
They did, along with a host of other megafaunas, We are talking about species like Bison latifrons and Bison antiquus.
And these were big animals.
These were absolute giants. They were forged in an incredibly harsh, predator-rich environment.
Wait, how big is a giant bison compared to the ones we see in Yellowstone today? Like, paint a picture for me.
Okay, imagine a modern bison, which is already massive, right?
Yeah, they're huge.
And then scale it up significantly. Bison latifrons had horns that could stand over 7 feet from tip to tip.
You've got to be kidding me. 7 feet.
Yes, that is wider than most humans are tall, just in headgear.
That is terrifying.
And they were surviving, alongside woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, American lions, and saber-toothed cats. So the bison we see today emerged from this ancient, hardened lineage.
So they're not just big cows.
Not at all. They aren't passive lumbering cows. They are survivors of a lost world. They were built by extreme cold, tough prairie grass, pack wolves, and the absolute necessity of constant movement.
Which explains so much about their physical adaptations. I mean, if you look at a modern bison, they have that massive, iconic shoulder hump.
Right.
And for a long time, I just assumed that was fat storage, like a camel. Or maybe just something decorative for mating displays.
A lot of people think that. But it's actually a massive structure of solid muscle. It's supported by these really elongated vertebrae in their back. That hump is literally an anatomical engine.
An engine for what?
It powers their heavy front quarters and their enormous heads.
But why do they need so much power just in their neck and head?
Because of the winter. On the Great Plains, the snow can get incredibly deep and hard-packed, and a modern bison requires roughly 1.6% of its body mass in dry vegetation every single day.
Wow.
Yeah. If you have a bull weighing up to 2,000 pounds, that is a staggering amount of grass to find when the ground is covered in a foot of solid ice and snow.
So how do they get to it?
They use their heads literally like giant snowplows.
Oh, wow.
The muscle in that hump allows them to sweep their heavy heads back and forth, moving massive amounts of snow aside to uncover the winter grass buried deep beneath.
That is brilliant. They are physically engineered to survive winters that would kill almost anything else.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They aren't just surviving the environment. The source material emphasizes that bison are ecosystem engineers.
Yes, and this is where the Bannock framework of looking at the ecosystem as a ship really comes into play. Bannock views the bison as a core member of the prairie's engine room.
The engine room.
Right. They aren't passengers on the grass. They are the crew keeping the biological machinery running.
But how does simply eating grass engineer an ecosystem? I mean, they're just eating.
Well, it comes down to the mechanics of how they graze. They don't act like lawnmowers, cutting everything down uniformly to the soil.
Right.
As a massive herd moves across the plains, they graze in a highly patchy, uneven manner. They might heavily graze one area, trample another, and then leave a neighboring patch completely untouched.
Okay, but if I'm a bird or an insect on the prairie, why does patchy grass matter to me? Why is that better than a nice uniform lawn?
Because different species have entirely different survival needs. That unevenness is the absolute foundation of biodiversity on the plains.
Give me an example.
So, for example, some ground-nesting birds, like the mountain plover, they need very short grass to nest so they can see predators coming from far away.
Makes sense.
But other species, like the meadowlark, need tall, dense grass for cover and shade. By grazing unevenly, the bison create a mosaic of different microhabitats.
Oh, I see.
They build the architecture that allows a massive variety of other species to coexist in the same broader landscape.
It reminds me of the IT department at a massive corporation.
That's an interesting analogy.
Think about it. You go about your day, you send your emails, you use the servers, and you don't even realize how entirely dependent the whole company is on this constant invisible background labor.
Right.
But the second the IT department is removed, the moment the servers go down, the entire structure grinds to a devastating halt.
That is a great way to visualize it. The prairie without the bison is an operating system that has lost its core processor. And grazing is just one part of their engineering. We also have to talk about wallowing.
Wallowing, like rolling around in the dirt.
Right. Bison will drop to the ground and violently roll in the exposed dirt.
Why do they do that?
They do this to help shed their thick winter coats, to deter biting insects by coating themselves in dust, and, during the mating season, the rut bulls wallow to leave their scent and display dominance.
But doing this creates actual geographical features, right?
It does. A 2,000-pound animal thrashing in the dirt creates a massive depression in the earth. These are called wallows, or microbasins.
Okay.
And the sheer weight of the bison compacts the soil at the bottom of the depression. So when the spring rains finally come, that compacted earth doesn't absorb the water immediately.
So it pools up.
Exactly. It holds the water much longer than the surrounding prairie.
So they are inadvertently creating little ponds.
Yes, they become temporary vernal pools. In an arid environment like the plains, a tiny pool of standing water is an absolute lifeline.
I can imagine.
It supports amphibians, specific types of moisture-loving plant life, and provides crucial drinking water for smaller mammals and birds.
Mm.
And then, of course, there's the dung.
The buffalo chips.
The dung is an entire micro-ecosystem unto itself.
Really?
Oh, yeah. When you have tens of millions of large herbivores moving across the landscape, they're processing massive amounts of vegetation and returning those nutrients directly to the soil. But before the nutrients even enter the soil, the dung feeds an enormous insect food web. We're talking dung beetles, flies, and grubs.
Yeah.
And that insect explosion then feeds the birds and the small mammals.
So you have the grass architecture, the water retention, and the nutrient cycling all being driven by this one species.
Exactly.
The literal engine room of the prairie. But wait, let me stop you there because I have a serious logistical question.
Sure.
If this animal is a 2,000-pound, fast-moving, highly aggressive survivor of the Ice Age,
Yeah.
how in the world did early humans, armed only with stone-tipped weapons and absolutely zero horses, even begin to hunt something so incredibly dangerous on foot?
That is the ultimate survival question. And it takes us deep into the archaeological history of North America, because humans have been hunting bison on this continent for over 10,000 years.
10,000 years.
We know this from sites like Folsom down in New Mexico.
What exactly did they find at Folsom?
Well, in the 1920s, archaeologists at Folsom uncovered something that completely rewrote the timeline of human history in the Americas.
What was?
They found a very distinct, beautifully crafted stone spear point, what we now call a Folsom point lodged, directly between the fossilized ribs of an extinct species of giant Ice Age bison.
Wow. So that is definitive proof. Humans and megafauna overlapping.
Exactly. But to your question of how they did it, because the bison was this massive, moving weather front of muscle and horn, early human survival completely depended on adapting to the herd's rhythm.
Right. You can't just bully a herd like that.
No, you couldn't control the herd. You couldn't force it into a pen like domesticated sheep.
The technology of the early hunt wasn't just about the sharpness of the spear. The true technology was a profound understanding of physics, animal psychology, and terrain.
Let's break down those early methods, because the logistics are just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the buffalo jumps.
There's a famous one called Head Smashed In up in Alberta, Canada. Walk me through the mechanics of a jump, because it's not just running behind a herd and yelling until they fall off a cliff, right?
Far from it. A buffalo jump is an absolute masterpiece of collective human engineering. It required days, sometimes weeks, of choreography.
Thanks.
Oh, yes. First, scouts had to locate a herd that was in the right geographical position. Then, they had to constantly monitor the wind.
Why is the wind so critical?
Because a bison's primary defense mechanism is its sense of smell. They have these massive olfactory bulbs. If the wind shifted and carried human scent to the herd, the animals would instantly scatter, and weeks of planning would be ruined.
Wow.
So hunters always had to work downwind.
Right.
Once the herd was located, the community would build drive lanes.
Drive lanes, what are those?
Think of them as a massive V-shaped funnel leading toward the cliff edge. These lanes could stretch for miles.
1 mile.
Yeah. They were marked by small piles of stones called cairns, piles of brush, and sometimes people just hiding under hides.
But how do you get the herd into the funnel without spooking them? I mean, they have a great sense of smell.
It was an incredibly high-stakes operation of animal manipulation.
Yeah.
Hunters would use disguise. A highly skilled hunter might drape themselves in a wolf skin and mimic a wolf's movements near the rear of the herd.
Oh, wow.
Just enough to agitate the bison and make them slowly move away from the threat.
That's so smart.
And meanwhile, another hunter might drape themselves in a bison calf robe and mimic the bleating of a lost calf near the front. This would draw the protective led cows forward into the mouth of the drive lanes.
That sounds absolutely terrifying. You're on foot, dressed as a calf, trying to coax hundreds of 2,000-pound animals toward you.
The bravery and skill required are just staggering, and
Yeah.
they had to inch the herd forward, because if the herd panicked too soon, they would break the lines and scatter.
Right.
Only at the very last moment, when the herd was deep inside the drive lanes and perfectly positioned near the precipice, would the hunters trigger a stampede.
How'd they do that?
People hiding behind the rock cairns would jump up, wave hides, and shout. The bison in the rear would surge forward in a panic, and the sheer momentum of the herd pushing from behind, would force the animals in the front over the cliff edge.
So the physics of the stampede essentially does the work for them.
Exactly.
But jumps weren't the only method. What happens in the winter, or if you aren't near a cliff?
They used impounds, or pounds. These were essentially corral traps.
Right.
In the winter, hunters might construct massive enclosures out of heavily packed snowbanks or timber and thick brush.
Okay.
Using the same principles of the drive lanes in the wind, they would manipulate the herd into these constructed traps, where the animals would be contained and could be safely killed at much closer range.
But what struck me most deeply in exploring this history is the emphasis on what happens after the stampede or after the impound. The kill itself, as dangerous and complex as it was just the beginning.
Very true.
The processing of the animal was the true test of the civilization.
This is where the community aspect of the Bannock framework is so apparent. The hunt is not a moment of individual glory for one person with a spear. It is a massive, coordinated crew operation.
Right, because of the sheer amount of meat.
Because if you successfully drive 50 bison over a cliff, and you do not have a highly organized, immediate system to process that meat, it will spoil. All of that life taken would be completely wasted.
And the labor involved is staggering. We are talking about communities that had over 150 distinct uses for the bison. They weren't just taking the backstraps and leaving the rest.
Not at all. The butchering required immense anatomical knowledge. They had to field dress the animals quickly, skin them without puncturing the hides, and sort the meat based on exactly how it would be preserved.
And their preservation technology was incredible.
It really was. They would slice the meat paper thin and dry it in the sun or over slow, smoky fires to remove the moisture so bacteria couldn't grow.
And then there's the absolute masterpiece of survival food, pemmican.
Pemmican, yes.
How exactly does pemmican work biochemically?
It's brilliant. You take that deeply dried meat, which has been stripped of its water weight, and you pound it into a fine powder.
Okay.
Then you mix that protein powder with rendered bison fat tallow and sometimes dried berries for micronutrients.
So it's dense protein and dense fat.
Extremely dense. By removing the water and sealing the protein in fat, you create an incredibly calorie-rich food that is highly portable.
Like an ancient energy bar.
Basically, yeah. If stored properly in a sealed rawhide container of parfleche, pemmican could last for years without spoiling.
Years.
Years. It was the fuel that allowed mobility. A hunter or a trader could carry a relatively small, lightweight pouch of pemmican and have enough calories to survive for weeks in freezing temperatures. It was literally time and distance stored in food.
And the physical materials they extracted from the animal were just as vital?
The material culture was entirely built around the bison. The thick winter hides became robes for sub-zero temperatures. Thinner hides became the covers for tipis, which were perfectly adapted to the high winds of the plains. They took the bones and fashioned them into scrapers for tanning, awls for sewing clothing, and hoes for agriculture.
What about sinew? I hear that word a lot in historical contexts, but what actually is it, and how is it used?
Sinew is the tough, fibrous tendon tissue, usually taken from the back or the legs of the bison. When it's dried and pounded, it separates into incredibly strong, thin fibers.
Oh, like thread.
Exactly. Early peoples used it as thread for sewing leather garments and, vitally, as the backing for bows and for bowstrings. It's incredibly resilient. They also use the stomachs and bladders as watertight vessels for carrying water.
Really?
Yeah, or even as cooking pots by dropping hot stones into the water inside the stomach lining to bring it to a boil.
That is so resourceful. They even use the dung for fire, right?
Yes, on the vast, treeless stretches of the plains, dried buffalo chips were the primary source of fuel for cooking and warmth. It was a complete self-sustaining life support system.
Wow.
As the historical lens points out, the bison was a moving pantry, a workshop, a wardrobe, and a sacred relation, all combined into a single life form.
Which brings up a profound philosophical question that the source material speculates on. Does the full, meticulous use of an animal make the act of killing it more ethical? Or does it simply make the relationship more honest?
It's a complex question. It's important to state that the history wasn't a flawless utopia. Archaeology shows us sites, like the bonfire shelter in Texas, where early hunters occasionally drove more bison over a cliff than they could possibly process, resulting in waste.
Right. Human error.
Human error and the chaos of the hunt always existed. But fundamentally, the subsistence relationship between indigenous peoples and the bison was built on a foundation of reciprocity.
What does reciprocity actually mean in the context of hunting a massive predator-adapted herbivore?
It means acknowledging a debt. The ritual, the ceremony, and the deep spiritual reverence that surrounded the bison across plains cultures wasn't just superstition.
Yay.
It was a profound psychological and cultural mechanism to metabolize the immense weight of taking life. When your entire existence depends absolutely on one creature, you understand viscerally that your survival comes at a cost.
That makes a lot of sense.
The ceremonies were a way of saying, we take what we need to live, we use all that we can, and we recognize that our future is entirely woven together with the health of your herd.
So, what does this all mean for us? I want you, the listener, to pause and consider what our modern food culture would look like if every single meal we ate carried the visible, physical labor of butchering, preserving, and deep communal gratitude.
It would be radically different.
Completely. What if you had to look the animal in the eye that provided your winter coat, the tools in your garage, your home's exterior, and your dinner? It completely shifts the moral weight of consumption. It makes consumption visible.
And that visibility, that local intimacy, is exactly what vanishes in the next chapter of the bison's history.
Yeah.
For millennia, the hunt was naturally bounded by local need and the physical limits of human labor. You only killed what you could process before it rotted, and you only processed what your community needed to survive the winter or to trade regionally. Human appetite had a natural, localized limit.
But then we hit the tipping point. What happens when technology untethers the hunt from local survival and instead connects it to distant, insatiable markets?
The entire moral and ecological framework shatters, and it happens in a couple of distinct technological stages. The first massive shift was the reintroduction of the horse to North America by the Spanish in the 16th and 17th centuries.
How did the horse change the dynamic?
It dramatically expanded the human range and altered the mechanics of the hunt. Suddenly, hunters didn't have to spend weeks orchestrating a complex buffalo jump. Mounted hunting allowed for dynamic, high-speed pursuit.
Right, you could just ride up to them.
Yeah. A hunter on horseback could ride directly into the herd, single out a specific animal, often a fat young cow for the best meat, and hide, and kill it at close range with a bow or an early firearm. It completely transformed plains economies, trade networks, and warfare.
But the horse alone didn't destroy the massive herds, did it?
No, it didn't. The herds were resilient enough, numbering in the tens of millions, to withstand mounted subsistence hunting. The true rupture, the catastrophic shift, came with the introduction of the long-range, heavy-caliber repeating rifle, paired with the rapid expansion of the railroads.
Ah, the extraction economy.
Yes, this is the shift from a reciprocal subsistence relationship to a ruthless commercial extraction economy. Following the Civil War, railroads began pushing deeper and deeper into the Great Plains.
Okay.
Suddenly, there was a logistical mechanism to transport vast amounts of goods back to the heavily industrialized East Coast and to Europe. And with the invention of new tanning chemicals in Europe that could process thick bison hides into industrial leather, a massive global market opened up.
So it became incredibly profitable to kill at a purely industrial scale. You were no longer hunting to feed your family for the winter. You were hunting to fill a boxcar.
Exactly. And the logistics of this market hunt were brutal in their efficiency. Professional market hunters would outfit wagons with heavy rifles, like the Sharps rifle, which could drop a bison from several hundred yards away.
Wow.
A skilled shooter could find a herd, set up a stand downwind, and shoot dozens, sometimes over 100 animals from a single position.
Just picking them off one by one.
Because of the bison psychology, if the lead cow was shot, the rest of the herd would often mill around in confusion rather than stampede. The hunter would just keep firing until the barrel of his rifle literally overheated.
That is sickening.
Then the skinners would come in behind him. Their only job was to strip the hide off the carcass as fast as possible.
And the waste. The sheer volume of waste is nauseating to think about.
In this new market paradigm, the animal was stripped of its status as a life support system. It was reduced to its most profitable parts. They took the hides, which were shipped east to become leather drive belts for factory machines in the Industrial Revolution, and winter coats.
Just the hides.
Sometimes they would cut out the tongues, which were salted and shipped east as a high-end delicacy for restaurants.
And the rest of the animal? The meat, the bones, the sinew.
Millions upon millions of pounds of meat were simply left on the prairie to rot. The plains were described as a sea of decaying carcasses. The stench was reportedly unbearable for miles.
This is the exact moment the Bannock lens points out that the living creature was transformed into inventory. The market completely severed the act of killing from the reality of need. It rewarded pure volume and speed.
It really did.
It narrowed a complex Ice Age survivor and ecosystem engineering marvel down to a single price tag on a ledger.
And what's fascinating here is, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the extraction didn't end with the hides. After the market hunters rolled through, leaving oceans of rotting flesh, the ecosystem was completely overloaded.
Right.
Eventually, the meat rotted away, leaving only millions of sun-bleached skeletons. That's when the bone pickers arrived.
I have to admit, the concept of the bone pickers was entirely new to me before reading through this material. What was that?
Years after the initial slaughter, settlers, farmers, and entrepreneurs would drive wagons across the silent, empty plains, gathering the skulls and skeletons of the millions of bison that had been killed.
Just picking up bones.
They piled them into literal mountains beside the railroad tracks. There are historical photographs of these bone piles that are several stories high.
What were they using the bones for?
They loaded them onto trains and shipped them to factories in the east. There, the bones were ground up to make agricultural fertilizer because they were rich in phosphorus.
Okay.
They were boiled down in massive vats to create industrial glue. And, perhaps most disturbingly, they were baked in kilns to create bone char, which was used as a filtering agent to refine raw sugar into pure white sugar.
They literally took the biological foundation of the prairie, the animal that engineered the grass and the water, and turned it into white sugar for tea in Boston.
Yeah.
I want to pause and push back on something here, a probing psychological question regarding the people on the ground. Look, if you were standing on the plains in 1874, and you were shooting 70 bison a day, and you were surrounded by miles of rotting bodies, did these hunters genuinely believe that the herds could never run out? Or did they realize what they were doing and just not care because the cash was too good?
That is a critical psychological trap. It's the illusion of endlessness. When a resource is so unimaginably vast, when you are looking at a single herd of 3 million animals that takes 3 days to pass by your camp, the human brain simply struggles to comprehend that it can be exhausted.
Wow.
One animal falls, then 1,000, then 100,000, and the horizon still looks full.
So the individual hunter thinks, my actions are just a drop in the bucket. The herd is infinite.
Yes. Humans have a profound, historically documented inability to respect ecological limits until those limits manifest as an absolute, undeniable emergency. We constantly mistake massive abundance for infinity. And by the time the horizon actually started to look empty, the economic machinery was moving way too fast to stop. The railroads had massive capital invested in needed freight, the East Coast factories needed cheap leather belts for their machines, and the men on the plains needed paychecks.
We see that psychological trap today with so many things: water aquifers, oceanic fish stocks, topsoil, even digital attention. The illusion that there's always more.
Absolutely. But, and this is where the historical narrative takes its darkest and most deliberate turn, we cannot attribute the destruction of the bison solely to unchecked capitalism and market frenzy.
It wasn't just money.
No. It was also actively encouraged and weaponized by geopolitical strategy.
This is a heavy turn, the weaponization of the herd. If we look clearly at the historical record, the destruction of the bison was not just an economic side effect, it was a weapon of empire.
The source material is very explicit about this dynamic. The decimation of the bison was a pivotal, calculated factor in the subjugation of indigenous societies across the Great Plains.
How so?
The United States military and federal policymakers recognized a very simple reality. As long as the massive bison herds roamed free, the Plains nations, the Comanche, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and others, would remain independent, highly mobile, and intensely resistant to colonial expansion.
Because you cannot easily conquer or subjugate a people if their pantry, their shelter, their tools, and their entire economy is walking right outside their door, regenerating itself every spring.
Precisely. If your enemy's supply lines are fully integrated into the wild landscape, conventional military tactics are incredibly difficult. The Plains nations could move their villages to follow the herds, evading the slower-moving U.S. cavalry.
Right.
So attacking the bison was a strategic way of attacking the food source. But it went far deeper than that.
It was an attack on their entire way of life.
It was an attack on the cultural, economic, and spiritual infrastructure of the Plains nations. General Philip Sheridan and other military leaders actively encouraged the market hunters. They saw the buffalo hunters as doing more to solve the so-called Indian question than the entire army could do.
That is incredibly grim.
By allowing and promoting the extermination of the herds, they were enacting an intentional starvation tactic. It was an act of colonial violence designed to force the Plains nations off the open range onto designated reservations and into a state of total reliance on government rations.
If we bring it back to that ship's captain metaphor from the source, the idea of the ecosystem as a ship removing the bison wasn't just pulling up the anchor. It was like ripping out the ship's kitchen, the engine room, the medicine bay, and the chapel all at exactly the same time while the crew was still on board.
Exactly.
It wasn't just losing an animal, it was losing an entire world.
And the collapse was absolute. The speed of it is what is so terrifying. We started with an estimated 30 to 60 million animals across the continent. By the year 1900, roughly 30 years after the height of the commercial hide hunt began, how many wild bison were left?
The numbers dropped to fewer than 1,000 in all of North America.
From tens of millions to fewer than 1,000. The Great Plains, which had vibrated with the sound of hooves for millennia, fell completely silent. The ecological engine was ripped out of the grassland.
Oh.
The indigenous nations were confined to reservations, their ancient lifeways violently interrupted. It stands as one of the most rapid, catastrophic, and deliberate ecological and cultural erasures in recorded human history.
Which brings us to the desperate aftermath. With the herd shattered and the plains echoing with this terrifying silence, a desperate attempt at preservation finally began. But saving the last few remaining animals created an entirely new set of ethical dilemmas.
To understand the recovery, we have to focus on Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is incredibly significant in this story because it is the only place in the lower 48 states that has retained a continuously free-ranging bison population since prehistoric times.
The only place?
Every other wild herd was wiped out. But even in the rugged isolation of Yellowstone, the situation was unbelievably dire. By 1902, due to persistent poaching and extreme winter conditions, the Yellowstone wild herd had been reduced to just about 24 animals.
24 individual animals holding the genetic legacy of the entire wild plains ecosystem.
It was a razor's edge. One bad winter, one outbreak of disease, and the wild bison would have been biologically extinct.
Wow.
But through the rise of early conservation movements, spearheaded by people who suddenly realized the finality of what had been done, things slowly shifted. The military was sent in to enforce strict protection laws against poachers in the park. Simultaneously, a few private ranchers and tribal members across the West had gathered small remnant herds to save them.
So they managed to pull them back from the absolute brink.
They did. Over decades, through careful breeding and protection, the species was saved from total biological extinction. Today, the numbers look much better on paper. The Department of the Interior supports 19 federal herds, roughly 11,000 bison, spread over 4.6 million acres of public land.
That sounds like a lot.
The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, now lists the American bison as near threatened rather than critically endangered.
And culturally, we usually celebrate this as a massive triumph, right? Like, we saved the national mammal, it's a conservation success story.
Right.
But the source material asks a really tough, uncomfortable question here. Bannock looks at this and observes that while saving the last few is heroic, it is also heartbreaking because it means we waited until almost everything was gone before deciding the creature mattered.
Yes.
I want to push back on the traditional conservation narrative we are all taught in school. Is this current version of conservation an apology, or is it just another slightly more benevolent form of control?
This raises an important question. That is the crucial distinction we have to make, the difference between recovery and restoration. What does it actually mean to save a species?
Because they're mostly fenced in, right?
If you look at the vast majority of bison alive today, they live behind fences. They are managed in many practical ways, essentially as livestock. They are branded or tagged, they are subjected to veterinary roundups, and they are routinely culled when their numbers exceed the carrying capacity of their specific fenced enclosure.
Because they can't migrate to find new food. They are stuck in the pasture we assign them.
Exactly. They have been saved from biological extinction, their DNA is secure, but they have not been allowed to return to being wild, migratory ecological actors. They aren't roaming hundreds of miles, engineering the prairie on a continental scale anymore.
They aren't the engine of the prairie anymore. They are a museum exhibit of the engine.
And the reason they are kept behind fences is intensely political and economic. The modern bison shares the Western landscape with a massive, politically powerful commercial cattle industry. And there's an intense ongoing conflict over land use, competition for grass, and most acutely, disease.
Disease.
Specifically, a bacterial disease called brucellosis.
What is brucellosis and why is it such a flashpoint?
Brucellosis is a disease that can cause cattle, bison, and elk to miscarry their calves. It has massive economic implications for the livestock industry. If a cattle herd tests positive, the rancher faces severe economic losses and strict quarantines.
That sounds serious.
Now, it's worth noting historically that brucellosis is not native to North America. It was originally introduced to the continent by European cattle and subsequently transmitted to wild elk and bison populations.
But today, the fear is that wild bison will transmit it back to domestic cattle.
Precisely. Some wild bison in the Yellowstone ecosystem do carry the bacteria. And this fear drives massive policy decisions. When the winter snows get too deep in Yellowstone, the bison do what they have been hardwired to do for millennia. They attempt to migrate to lower elevations to find grass.
Right.
But when they step across the invisible boundary of the national park and enter the state of Montana, they are stepping onto a mix of public and private ranching lands.
And the cattle industry has zero tolerance for them being there.
Zero tolerance. Because of the brucellosis risk and the competition for forage, the migration is actively stopped. Bison are hazed back into the park by rangers on horseback, ATVs, and even helicopters. Those that can't be hazed are often captured, quarantined, or lethally culled.
So the conflict isn't just biological. It's fundamentally about the limits of public versus private land.
It asks the ultimate question. Can a massive migratory species truly exist in a heavily privatized, fenced, modern landscape? The modern conservation system has saved the bison, but it demands that the bison remain in a designated box. If they step out of that box, they are punished for acting like wild animals.
Which perfectly sets up the final piece of this puzzle. If fenced conservation isn't true restoration, if keeping them in a designated box isn't honoring what the animal actually is, what is true restoration, where is this story heading next?
It's shifting.
Because the answer seems to lie in returning the leadership of this repair to the people whose relationship with the bison is the oldest.
We are currently witnessing a profound shift toward indigenous-led restoration. For Native nations across the plains, the return of the buffalo is not about historical nostalgia. It is not about creating a living museum or a tourist attraction.
Right.
It's about current political sovereignty, food security, ecological healing, and deep spiritual repair.
And the numbers here are incredibly hopeful. We're looking at organizations like the Intertribal Buffalo Council, which represents 86 tribes across 22 states. They are currently managing over 20,000 buffalo on tribal lands.
That is a massive undertaking.
And conservation groups are realizing they need to step back and support this. Organizations like the Nature Conservancy have facilitated the transfer of hundreds of buffalo back to ancestral lands to be directly managed by Native nations.
This completely changes the paradigm of conservation. The source notes phrase it beautifully. Restoring the buffalo under indigenous leadership is about putting trust back where violence tried to leave silence.
That's a powerful quote.
When tribes restore the bison to their lands, they are attempting to heal the ecology of the soil and the cultural trauma of the people simultaneously. Because in their worldview, you cannot separate the health of the land from the health of the people.
But this also forces us to confront a really difficult, highly nuanced topic: the ethics of the modern harvest. Because if the tribes are successfully restoring these herds and the herds grow, eventually they exceed the available land. They have to be managed, and that includes hunting.
Yes, it does.
Inside Yellowstone, public hunting is totally banned. But outside the park, as we discussed, there are complex state and tribal harvests, government management calls, and on private ranches, there are commercial trophy hunts.
The ethics of hunting a species that was so recently driven to the brink of extinction are incredibly complex and emotionally charged. But Bannock, our philosophical captain, asks a vital question here. A captain's question is not only, can we take? It is, what happens to the crew, the ship, and the waters after we do?
Meaning, what is the intent and the outcome of the harvest?
Exactly. An ethical modern harvest, particularly an indigenous treaty harvest, is not about extraction or creating inventory. It is an attempt to return to that original relationship of reciprocity. It's about harvesting for traditional food, for ceremony, to maintain a healthy herd size relative to the available land, and to ensure the animal is treated with deep reverence, not just as a wall trophy or a shrink-wrapped meat commodity.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I want you, the listener, to really chew on this conceptual framework. The analysis draws a brilliant comparison between 3 different ways humans interact with the land: farming, herding, and wild hunting.
It's a great distinction.
Think about it. Farming is entirely about controlled production. You plow the earth, you plant the seed in a row, you irrigate the water, you apply fertilizer, you harvest on a set date. It is about bending the natural world to your human schedule.
Yes.
Herding is about ownership and spatial boundaries. You put up a barbed wire fence, you brand the animal to prove it's yours, you control its genetics through breeding, you dictate exactly where it walks and what it eats.
Both farming and herding are systems designed to impose human will upon the landscape, to eliminate uncertainty. They are about control.
Right. But true wild harvest, the ancient relationship with the bison, is about the exact opposite. It is about adapting human life to the movement and the deep uncertainty of the wild. It requires extreme humility.
Exactly.
Domestication teaches us to say to the natural world, stay where I can count you. Stay inside the fence so I feel safe and my investment is secure. But wild harvest teaches a civilization to say, I will learn where you go. I will track the weather, I will read the grass, I will follow your migration, and I will adapt my needs to your rhythms.
That is the philosophical core of this entire exploration.
Yeah.
We have spent the last century operating almost exclusively under the stay where I can count you model. We have fenced, plowed, and paved the plain.
And we're seeing the results of that.
And we're seeing the intense ecological fragility of that approach everywhere. In topsoil loss and water depletion, in biodiversity collapse. The existence of the bison today asks us if we are brave enough to tolerate wildness again.
Which brings us to the end of this incredibly monumental journey. We've tracked the bison from its origins deep in the Ice Age, marveling at the biology of a true ecosystem engineer.
Yeah.
We've explored the millennia-deep integration with indigenous cultures who build brilliant, sustainable, reciprocal lifeways around the herd's migration. We've witnessed the horrific, catastrophic era of industrial extraction, where a living infrastructure was reduced to an inventory of hides and bone char and weaponized by an expanding empire to starve out resistance.
A heavy history.
And we've navigated this complex, tentative, modern era balancing fenced conservation against the deeply hopeful rise of indigenous-led restoration.
Throughout all of these eras, the bison serves as a mirror. It reflects our deepest human hungers, our incredible ingenuity and resilience, but also our capacity for staggering cruelty and short-sightedness. And ultimately, it reflects our capability for care and profound repair.
The author shares a final reflection from Bannock. He notes that true healing is inherently slow. The herd moves slowly. Trust returns slowly. The grass grows back slowly. And under starlight, slow is not failure. Slow is just how our eyes adjust to the dark.
It is a vital reminder that we don't have to fix the entire ecosystem overnight. True stewardship means gathering the crew, honestly and unflinchingly naming the damage we've done, and choosing day after day, year after year, to steer the ship toward repair.
And so I want to turn directly to you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. We spent an hour talking about how the near extinction of the bison shaped our past and how it intensely complicates our present landscape.
Right.
But look forward. As we face rapidly accelerating climate change, as our aquifers dry up and our topsoil depletes, as we realize we might need to fundamentally redesign our global agriculture just to survive, well, what if the bison isn't just a tragic historical victim to be managed behind a fence?
It's a great question.
What if the bison is actually a biological blueprint for how we might survive the next century on the Great Plains? What would happen if we stopped trying to control every single blade of grass and finally let the engine of the prairie truly run wild again?
It is a question of whether we have the courage to step back, dismantle some of our fences, and let the original crew take the wheel.
I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the boundaries between humanity and the wild, and next time you're out in an open space, close your eyes and listen for the thunder.